Andrew Napolitano has written a new book. It's entitled, "It is Dangerous to be Right When the Government is Wrong." Mr. Napolitano is the senior judicial analyst for Fox News, as well as host of Freedom Watch on the Fox Business Network. Welcome to Newsmax again, Judge.
Ashley, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. What exactly does the title of your book mean?
Well, the title of the book was suggested to me by Voltaire about 250 years ago. Only kidding. It's a one-liner from Voltaire, suggesting the truism that the government only guarantees freedom when its exercise pleases the government. This is the sixth book I've written on the Constitution and human freedom. They all have a similar theme, and that is that our freedoms come from our humanity. The government argues, even in a relatively free country like the United States, that our freedoms come from the government. Now, this is not an academic argument, because if the government is right and our freedoms come from the government, then a command of the president or legislation of the Congress can curtail our freedoms. But if I am right, and Jefferson is right, and the Declaration of Independence is right, and the Constitution is right, then our freedoms come from our humanity. And so decisions by the president or legislation by the Congress that limits our freedoms are invalid and of no lawful effect and shouldn't limit our freedoms at all. When we resist those decisions, it becomes dangerous.
You say in your book, if America is to survive, human liberty must be restored by any means necessary. Please explain that.
Well, you know, we live in a time in which the government recognizes no limits on its own power. It doesn't recognize the natural law. It doesn't recognize the federal law. It doesn't recognize the Constitution. The president in the past couple of weeks became judge, jury, and executioner for a very hated and probably guilty individual. But the Constitution says no person shall be denied life, liberty, or property, much less an American, which this guy was, without due process of law. We fought a war against the British, the Revolutionary War in large measure, because the king authorized British soldiers to write their own search warrants. And guess what the Patriot Act does? It lets federal agents write their own search warrants. So we need to be in the faces of those in the government in whose hands we've reposed the Constitution when they violate the Constitution. We need to be lobbying to repeal the 16th Amendment, which allows the public election of senators rather than the designation of them by state legislatures. We need to lobby to repeal the 17th Amendment, which is the income tax, the IRS, to starve the government and shrink it back down into the confines of the Constitution. If we don't do these things, we will lose our liberty, and the government will debase our currency, and there'll be bankruptcy, and there'll be riots in the streets.
At what point in our country's history did government begin to destroy our freedoms?
The very generation that wrote in the First Amendment, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." In some cases, the very same people who wrote that also voted in favor of and enacted and enforced the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the president or the Congress or to bring the government into disrepute. So the unhappy answer to your question is, almost from the very beginning of American government, it has waged war on liberty. Liberty was assaulted again, in my view, during the Civil War, when Lincoln arrested people because of their words and shut down newspapers because of their printing. But the real serious, heavy-duty, nanny-state regulation, the real development of a relationship between the federal government and individuals, began in the progressive era under Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. That's when the administrative state begins. That's when the federal government creates administrative agencies that are neither fish nor fowl. They're not in the executive branch and they're not in the legislative branch. They don't run for office, but they acquire power through appointment. They survive from one president to the next. And administrative agencies began regulating private behavior, and it started about 100 years ago. Coincidentally, that's also when the Federal Reserve and when the income tax started.
You say the government has the legal authority to track Americans' every move. How so?
The government has developed software which will permit it to follow anybody who has a cell phone in their pocket when the cell phone is on. The government has developed software which will permit it to follow anyone who has a cell phone when the cell phone is off. The only safe way to keep the government from following you when your cell phone is with you is to disable it by removing the battery. Question, can the government legally do this? since the Fourth Amendment says if the government wants to search you or seize you, it has to get a search warrant from a judge. Answer, the Supreme Court will tell us in about 2 months. The government claims it can come onto your property and open your garage door and go into your garage and open up your car and put a GPS tracking device in there if you don't carry a cell phone. Can the government do that? Answer, the Supreme Court will tell us in a couple of months. In the interim, the government does this. Remember this guy that ran for president in 2008 and promised hope and change and transparency? It is his administration that is bringing Big Brother right into our faces.
In your opinion, is the Obama administration shredding the Constitution faster than ever?
Yes. Yes. I have never hesitated to attack the administration of George W. Bush. In fact, I have argued in this book and elsewhere that the Patriot Act is the most abominable congressional assault on personal freedom since the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were enacted in the late 1700s. The Obama administration, notwithstanding the president's lofty words as a candidate and even as a president, has actually ratcheted up the police state, has ratcheted up the assault on personal liberties. I remember having a hypothetical debate at Fox 10 years ago, shortly after 9/11. And the debate went like this. Could the president kill an American if the president thought the American was a danger to national security? And when I posed that question, we all laughed, saying, this could never happen. This is the United States of America. We have the Constitution. Now it happens and nobody does anything about it. I remember arguing, could the president start a war on his own? And the answer was no, of course not. The Constitution says only the Congress can declare war. Well, we're in Libya and the Congress never declared it, and we all know what happened to Gaddafi today. So the answer is the president is shredding the Constitution more so than George W. Bush did. It is not only this president who does it, but this president is doing it in a more in-your-face, more obvious, and if I may, more boastful way.
All right, considering Fast and Furious and the Solyndra scandals, together with the killing in Yemen of an American-born suspected terrorist, do you think Obama is doing anything that approaches the level of an impeachable offense?
Yes. I think killing an American is an impeachable offense. Unfortunately, Solyndra is not, because of legislation enacted in the Bush administration, which allows the president the discretion to decide to whom he will lend tax dollars, even if those people happen to be his political friends. President Bush started all this stuff with TARP and his 2 stimulus programs. But the killing of an American is unforgivable under the Constitution, and it is an impeachable offense. And the president, if not being impeached, should be indicted for it after he leaves office.
You mentioned a long time ago that you think Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. Texas Governor Rick Perry was widely criticized for saying the same thing. Was that criticism of him appropriate or fair?
I think the criticism of him was appropriate and fair if you're a big government type that thinks the federal government should bribe people with their own money. But the bottom line is, in my view, in this respect, Governor Perry was correct. It is a Ponzi scheme. It pays out more money than it takes in. It requires people to contribute to an entity that loses 25%. Look, the Social Security Administration admits that for every dollar that you put in, the most you're going to get out is 75 cents. Who would go to a bank if the bank was only going to return 75% of the dollar that you put in there? Nobody would do this voluntarily. And yet the federal government forces this upon us, and it is nowhere even hinted at in the Constitution.
Those Occupy Wall Street demonstrators who are reportedly being fed gourmet meals every day, do they have a valid message, or are they just useful idiots for unions, Marxists, and other radical left elements?
I think the answer is both. I think they do have a valid message. They have a legitimate complaint that their future in the economic world is grim. It is grim because the government has spent the future's money today and has mortgaged the future by printing cash and borrowing against the future. It is grim because the government fights wars of opportunity. When they say end the Fed and end the wars, I am with them. But when they say take from the rich and give to those who don't have it, the Constitution is supposed to prevent that from happening. The political side of this is just as dangerous. The political side of this is that labor unions and hard left organizations and entities of the Democratic National Committee are going to co-opt those young people and take over the message. Isn't it strange that people whose real gripe is with the government are now being embraced by the people that are in the government? That will drive independents and moderates away from the president. I think he embraces this crowd at his political peril.
Again, the name of his newest book, It is Dangerous to be Right When the Government is Wrong. Judge Andrew Napolitano, always a pleasure to speak with you, sir. Thanks so much.
Pleasure's mine, Ashley. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.